The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the chain gang, casting harsh shadows across the dusty ground. Li Wei's shackled hands gripped the rusted pickaxe as sweat poured down his weathered face, mixing dirt and salt into stinging rivulets. The iron chains around his ankles clinked with each labored movement, a constant reminder of his captivity. "Move faster, you Chinese dog," barked Overseer Jackson, his tobacco-stained teeth gleaming in a cruel grin. "These rocks will not break themselves." The leather whip in his hand cracked against his palm, a menacing promise of pain. Li Wei's parched throat burned as he watched Jackson drink deeply from his canteen, the precious water spilling carelessly onto the ground. When Li Wei had dared to ask for water an hour ago, Jackson had laughed and poured it into the sand instead. 6 months ago, Li Wei whispered to himself, his mind drifting back to that fateful evening that had destroyed his life. He had been working near the Morrison Ranch, tending to his small vegetable garden that he had cultivated with such care. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, when he heard a woman's terrified scream pierce the evening air. Through the wooden fence, Li Wei saw Mrs. Morrison struggling against a drunken man who had cornered her near the barn. Her reticule was torn open, coins scattered on the ground as she desperately tried to protect a small leather pouch. "Please, stop. That money is for my children. It's medicine," she pleaded, but the intoxicated man only laughed, his hands grabbing roughly at the remaining coins in her jewelry. Li Wei's heart pounded. Every instinct told him to help, despite knowing the dangerous consequences of interfering in white people's affairs. But he could not stand by and watch such theft. Without hesitation, he climbed over the fence and rushed toward them. "Leave her alone," he shouted, grabbing the man's shoulder and pulling him away from the frightened woman. The drunk stumbled backward, his bloodshot eyes filled with rage as they focused on Li Wei's face. The drunk man, whose name was Pete Harley, stumbled away from the Morrison Ranch that night with rage burning in his alcohol-clouded mind. His face stung from where Li Wei had pushed him, but it was his wounded pride that hurt most. A Chinese immigrant had dared to lay hands on him, a white man. Mrs. Morrison had fled into her house, locking the door behind her, leaving Li Wei standing alone in the gathering darkness. He had hoped she would tell the truth about what happened, but fear made people do terrible things. The next morning, Pete Harley sat in Murphy's saloon, surrounded by a group of local ranchers and drifters. His story grew more twisted with each telling, each lie building upon the last like a house of cards made from hatred. "That Chinese devil attacked me." Harley slammed his fist on the wooden table, making the whiskey glasses jump. "I was just walking past the Morrison place when I heard screaming. When I went to help, that Chinese scum was robbing poor Mrs. Morrison." The men around the table leaned in closer, their faces darkening with manufactured outrage. These were hard men, weathered by years of frontier life, and many harbored deep resentments against the Chinese workers who had come to build the railroads and stayed to compete for jobs. Tom Bradley, a cattle rancher who had lost several workers to Chinese competitors willing to work for lower wages. "These people come to our country and think they can steal from decent folks. I fought them off," Harley continued, his voice growing stronger with each fabrication. "But he was like a wild animal." Mrs. Morrison was crying and begging for help. "He had taken her money and was trying to steal her jewelry when I arrived." The lies flowed like poison from his tongue, each word carefully chosen to inflame the racial prejudices that simmered just beneath the surface of their small community. By the time Harley finished his tale, the men were ready for violence. That very night, orange flames licked at the Morrison barn, consuming hay and wood in a hungry blaze that could be seen for miles. The morning after the fire, Sheriff William Crawford arrived at Li Wei's modest shack with 3 deputies, their boots crunching on the dry earth. The smell of smoke still hung in the air, and charred timber from the Morrison barn lay scattered across the ground like broken bones. "Li Wei," Crawford shouted, his hand resting on the handle of his revolver. "Come out with your hands where we can see them." Li Wei emerged slowly, confusion written across his weathered face. He had spent the night tending to his injured neighbor, his horse, and had no knowledge of the fire until he saw the smoke rising in the distance. "You are under arrest for arson and robbery," Crawford announced, producing a pair of heavy iron shackles. "Pete Harley has sworn out a complaint against you, and half the town saw that barn burning last night." "I did not burn anything," Li Wei protested, his English broken but earnest. I was helping old Mr. Chen with his sick horse. He could tell you where I was. The word of another Chinese does not count for much around here. Deputy Morgan sneered, spitting tobacco juice near Li Wei's feet. Besides, everyone knows you people stick together and lie for each other. The trial, if it could be called that, took place 3 days later in the cramped courthouse that doubled as a community meeting hall. Judge Hamilton presided over the proceedings with the same enthusiasm he might show for swatting flies. The 12 jurors were all white men, most of whom had already heard Harley's version of events in Murphy's saloon. Li Wei sat alone at the defendant's table, no lawyer willing to represent a Chinese immigrant accused of attacking a white woman. Pete Harley testified with theatrical flair, his voice carrying across the packed courtroom as he described the savage attack he claimed to have witnessed. That Chinese came at Mrs. Morrison like a wild beast, Harley declared, pointing an accusing finger at Li Wei. When I tried to stop the robbery, he turned on me with unnatural strength. Mark my words, gentlemen, this is what happens when we let these people into our Christian community. Mrs. Morrison was not called to testify. Judge Hamilton explained that it would be too traumatic for the poor woman to relive such a horrifying robbery. The jury deliberated for exactly 7 minutes before returning with their verdict, guilty on all charges. The Arizona Territorial Prison chain gang was a hell on earth disguised as justice. Li Wei found himself shackled to 19 other men, their ankles connected by heavy iron chains that clanked with every labored step. The camp sprawled across a barren stretch of desert, surrounded by nothing but cactus, rattlesnakes, and the endless, punishing sun. Each morning began before dawn with the harsh clang of a bell and the shouted curses of the guards. The prisoners were marched out in formation, their chains forcing them to move in awkward unison like some grotesque dance. They worked 12 hours a day breaking rocks for a new railroad line, their hands bleeding and blistered, their backs bent under the weight of their labor. Overseer Jackson ruled the camp with cruel efficiency, his weathered face bearing the scars of countless frontier battles. He took particular pleasure in tormenting the non-white prisoners, reserving his most creative punishments for Li Wei and the handful of other Chinese men who had found themselves trapped in this nightmare. The Chinese ones break easier than the others, Jackson often told his subordinates, his voice carrying across the dusty compound. They are not built for real work like white men. The prisoners came from all walks of life, united only by their misfortune and the color of their skin. There was Miguel Santos, a Mexican vaquero convicted of stealing cattle he had never seen. James Running Bear, an Apache warrior sentenced for defending his family, his land against white settlers. Samuel Washington, a freed slave accused of looking at a white woman the wrong way. They slept on straw mattresses crawling with lice and scorpions, packed into wooden barracks that offered no protection from the desert's extremes. During the day, the temperature soared above 100 degrees. At night, it dropped so low that men shivered uncontrollably, their teeth chattering like castanets. Food was scarce and rotten. Watery soup made from spoiled vegetables, bread so hard it could break teeth, and occasionally a piece of meat so tough and gristly that even the guards joked it might have been buzzard. Many prisoners lost dangerous amounts of weight, their clothes hanging loose on their skeletal frames. Disease spread through the camp like wildfire. Men died from dysentery, pneumonia, and infected wounds that never healed properly in the harsh conditions. The dead were buried in unmarked graves beyond the camp perimeter, their names forgotten by everyone except their fellow prisoners. Thomas Jefferson Brown had been in the chain gang for 8 months when Li Wei arrived. A tall, powerfully built man with intelligent eyes and calloused hands that spoke of years of honest labor, Thomas had been a blacksmith in New Orleans before false accusations of theft brought him to this desert purgatory. At first, the two men regarded each other with suspicion. Thomas had grown up hearing stories about Chinese workers taking jobs from black men, while Li Wei had been taught that African Americans were dangerous and violent. The harsh realities of prison life, however, had a way of stripping away such prejudices. Their first real interaction came during the 3rd week of Li Wei's imprisonment. Overseer Jackson had been particularly cruel that day, denying water to the Chinese prisoners while forcing them to work extra hours in the blazing sun. Li Wei collapsed near a pile of broken rocks, his vision blurring from heat exhaustion. Thomas, despite being chained to his own work detail, managed to maneuver close enough to share his meager water ration. "Drink slowly," he whispered, glancing nervously at the guards. "Make it last. Why do you help me?" Li Wei asked when he had recovered enough to speak. His English was improving from necessity, each word carved from desperation and the need to survive. "Because we are both trapped in the same cage," Thomas replied, his voice low but firm. "The color of our skin might be different, but our chains are made of the same iron." Over the following weeks, the two men began to talk during the brief moments when the guards were not watching. Thomas spoke of his wife and daughter back in Louisiana, how he had been saving money to buy them a small house with a garden where his little girl could play safely. Li Wei shared his own dreams of opening a small restaurant where he could serve the traditional foods of his homeland, perhaps even teach curious Americans about Chinese culture. Both men clung to these dreams like lifelines in an ocean of despair. "The guards want us to hate each other," Thomas observed one evening as they lay on their straw mattresses, listening to the desert wind howl through the barracks walls. "They know that if we unite, we become stronger than they can handle." Li Wei nodded, understanding more each day how the system worked to keep oppressed people fighting among themselves rather than challenging their oppressors. It was a revelation that would change both of their lives forever. The escape plan began to take shape during the sweltering heat of July. Thomas had noticed that the guards changed shifts at midnight, leaving a brief window when only two men patrolled the entire perimeter. Li Wei had observed that the chains connecting their ankle shackles were secured with old locks that might be picked with the right tools. Miguel Santos, the Mexican vaquero, had been quietly collecting small pieces of metal from their worksite. His nimble fingers, trained from years of intricate leatherwork, proved surprisingly adept at fashioning crude lockpicks from discarded railroad spikes and bent nails. "We will have only one chance," Thomas whispered during their meager evening meal. "If we fail, Jackson will make sure we never see daylight again." The tension between the conspirators was palpable. Samuel Washington, the former slave, worried that involving Li Wei would bring unwanted attention to their group. "The guards watch him closer than the rest of us," he argued. "His yellow skin makes him stand out like a beacon in the darkness." Li Wei felt the familiar sting of rejection, but Thomas stood firm. "We started this together, and we finish it together. No man gets left behind because of the color of his skin." James Running Bear, the Apache warrior, had been studying the desert terrain during their daily marches. "There is a water source 15 miles northeast," he said quietly. "My grandfather showed me the place when I was young. If we can reach it before dawn, we might survive long enough to make it to the Mexican border." The psychological pressure of keeping their secret while maintaining normal routines proved almost unbearable. Every glance from a guard, every unexpected question, every deviation from their usual schedule sent waves of paranoia through the group. Li Wei found himself starting at shadows, his heart racing whenever Overseer Jackson looked in his direction. Sleep became impossible. The men lay awake on their straw mattresses, minds racing with possibilities and fears. What if someone betrayed them for better treatment? What if the locks proved too difficult to pick? What if they were caught before they even left the compound? The night before their planned escape, Li Wei stared at the stars through a crack in the barracks roof. He thought of his family back in China, wondering if they were still alive, if they knew what had become of him. He thought of Mrs. Morrison, hoping she would someday find the courage to speak the truth. "Tomorrow we become free men or dead men," Thomas whispered in the darkness. "Either way, we will no longer be slaves." The escape attempt began at exactly midnight. Miguel's improvised lockpicks worked better than anyone had dared hope. And within minutes the 5 men had freed themselves from their ankle shackles. They moved like ghosts through the sleeping barracks, their bare feet silent on the wooden floor. Everything went wrong at the perimeter fence. A rattlesnake, disturbed by their movement, struck at Samuel Washington's leg. His involuntary cry of pain pierced the desert silence like a gunshot. Within seconds, lanterns blazed to life across the compound and guards came running from every direction. "There, by the north fence!" shouted Deputy Morgan, his rifle already aimed at the fleeing prisoners. The manhunt lasted 3 hours. Bloodhounds tracked them through the desert scrub while mounted guards surrounded them in an ever-tightening circle. By dawn, all 5 men were back in custody, their hands bound behind their backs and their hopes crushed like the broken rocks they had been forced to split. Overseer Jackson stood before them in the courtyard, his face twisted with rage and satisfaction. The other prisoners had been forced to watch, their eyes reflecting the same fear that now consumed the recaptured men. 20 lashes each, Jackson announced, his voice carrying across the silent compound. "Let this be a lesson to anyone else who thinks they can make fools of us." The whipping post stood in the center of the yard like a wooden monument to suffering. Li Wei watched as the guards prepared the leather whips, their braided ends stained dark with the blood of previous victims. His mind raced with terror as he imagined the agony that awaited him. Thomas was to be first. They stripped him to the waist and bound his wrists to the post, his powerful back muscles tensing as he prepared for the ordeal. Jackson raised the whip high above his head, the leather catching the morning sunlight. Suddenly, the thundering sound of hoofbeats interrupted the proceedings. A dust cloud rose from the desert road as a lone rider approached the camp at full gallop. The horse was magnificent, a black stallion that moved with the grace of a dancer despite its obvious exhaustion. The rider was a tall man with steel-gray hair and a weathered face marked by old scars. He wore the uniform of a Union Army colonel, though the war had ended 15 years earlier. Most striking were his eyes, pale blue and sharp as winter ice. "I am Colonel Marcus Webb," he announced, dismounting with practiced ease. "I have been appointed as the new administrator of this facility, effective immediately." Colonel Marcus Webb had seen enough injustice during his 30 years of military service to recognize it immediately. He had fought alongside men of every color during the Civil War, learning that courage had nothing to do with skin color. "Lower that whip, Overseer Jackson," Webb commanded, his voice carrying absolute authority. Jackson, his face flushed red. "Sir, these men attempted to escape. Prison regulations require punishment. I am familiar with the law, which requires punishments be proportionate and humane. 20 lashes could kill a man in this heat." Webb began investigating the campus operations. What he discovered sickened him. Records showed harsh sentences for minor infractions, particularly for non-white prisoners. Men were worked to death for crimes deserving small fines. Li Wei, this case caught his attention immediately. A Chinese immigrant convicted of arson and robbery based solely on testimony from a known drunk, with no physical evidence and no victim testimony. Webb recognized a frame-up. "Tell me about the night you were arrested," Webb said during a private interview with Li Wei, contrasting sharply with his predecessor, his brutal methods. Li Wei spoke carefully, his English improved by necessity. He described the attack on Mrs. Morrison, his intervention, and subsequent false accusations. Webb listened without interruption, making notes in his leather journal. "Your word alone cannot overturn a conviction," Webb explained. "But irregularities in your case demand investigation. The victim's absence from your trial is particularly troubling." Webb interviewed Thomas, Samuel, Miguel, and James, documenting systemic abuses. Each story revealed racial prejudice masquerading as justice. The colonel reviewed court records, visited crime sites, and spoke with cooperative townspeople. Many refused to talk, but some whispered suspicions about Pete Harley's character. Webb's investigation revealed corruption involving local officials and law enforcement. The chain gang provided cheap railroad labor, and certain individuals profited from keeping it stocked with prisoners, regardless of guilt. 3 weeks into his investigation, Colonel Webb received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Sarah Morrison arrived at the prison camp in a modest wagon, her hands trembling as she clutched a worn leather Bible. The guilt had been eating away at her conscience like acid, and she could no longer bear the weight of her silence. "Colonel Webb," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I must speak with you about Li Wei's case. I have been living with a terrible lie, and I cannot continue." Webb invited her into his office, offering her a chair and a glass of water. Mrs. Morrison, his face was pale and drawn, showing the toll that months of sleepless nights had taken on her spirit. "That Chinese man never robbed me," she confessed, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Pete Harley was the one who cornered me near the barn. He was drunk and trying to steal my money and jewelry. I was terrified. Li Wei saw what was happening and came to help me." Webb listened carefully as Mrs. Morrison recounted the true events of that evening. She described how Harley had threatened her family if she spoke the truth, how he had convinced the town that Li Wei was the real criminal. "I was a coward," she sobbed. "I let an innocent man go to prison because I was afraid of what people would think, afraid of what Harley might do to my family. The fire started later that night, but I know Li Wei had nothing to do with it." Armed with this testimony, Webb confronted Pete Harley at Murphy's saloon. The confrontation was swift and decisive. Faced with Mrs. Morrison's confession and Webb's evidence of corruption, Harley broke down and admitted his lies. He also confessed to burning the barn himself in a drunken rage after Li Wei had humiliated him. Within days, Webb had unraveled the entire conspiracy. Sheriff Crawford, Judge Hamilton, and several local businessmen were arrested for their roles in the corrupt system that had imprisoned innocent men for profit. The territorial governor, responding to Webb's detailed report, ordered immediate reviews of all cases involving non-white defendants from the past 2 years. Dozens of wrongful convictions were overturned, and the corrupt officials faced serious federal charges. Li Wei stood in Webb's office, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "You are free to go," the colonel said, handing him official papers that declared his conviction overturned and his name cleared. 6 months after their release, Li Wei and Thomas stood outside their newly built workshop on the outskirts of town, watching the morning sun paint the desert mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The sign above their door read, "Morrison Brothers Workshop," in both English and Chinese characters, a tribute to the woman whose courage had set them free. The territorial government had provided substantial compensation for their wrongful imprisonment, money that Li Wei and Thomas pooled together to create something unprecedented in the Arizona Territory, a business owned and operated by men of different races working as equals. Their workshop specialized in metalwork and carpentry, combining Thomas's blacksmithing skills with Li Wei's intricate woodworking techniques learned from his father back in China. They employed 6 workers, 2 Mexican craftsmen, 1 Apache leather worker, 1 Irish immigrant, and 2 former slaves who had found their way west seeking new opportunities. "Never thought I would see the day when a Chinese man and a black man could be business partners," Thomas remarked, wiping sweat from his brow as he watched their diverse crew working together in harmony. Li Wei smiled, his hands carefully carving decorative patterns into a wooden cabinet door. "Colonel Webb taught us that justice is not about the color of our skin, but about the content of our character." Their success had not come without challenges. Some townspeople still harbored racial prejudices, occasionally refusing to do business with them or spreading malicious rumors. But word of their excellent craftsmanship spread throughout the territory, bringing customers from as far away as Phoenix and Tucson. Mrs. Morrison had become an unexpected ally, using her influence in the community to support their business and advocate for racial tolerance. She often brought her children to the workshop, teaching them that people should be judged by their actions rather than their appearance. On Sundays, Li Wei would prepare traditional Chinese meals for his workers and their families, while Thomas shared stories of his homeland in Louisiana. These gatherings became legendary in their small community, breaking down barriers and building friendships that crossed all racial lines. As the sun set over the Arizona desert, Li Wei reflected on his journey from the depths of despair and the chain gang to this moment of hope and prosperity. The American dream, he realized, was not about individual success, but about creating a society where all people could thrive together regardless of their origins.